The initial sign was barely perceptible. From the enclosure's far corner, a low, tremulous groan arose. The lioness, her tawny coat dusty and dull, lay in unusual stillness, her eyes half closed, ears twitching at the faintest noise. Each careful step the vet took was burdened by a weight of concern. "Easy now, easy girl," he whispered, kneeling at a measured distance, his hands gentle but steady. Her head lifted briefly, nostrils flaring wide, before she settled again. Hesitant and uneven, her breathing was shallow. Months of dedicated observation had prepared the shelter staff for this anticipated day. Yet, the unease that now rippled through the enclosure was something they could not have prepared for. Through the tall fence bars, the sun slanted, casting elongated, striped shadows across her form. In the warm shafts of light, dust motes drifted, catching on the whiskers of her muzzle as she released one slow moan, then another. The air was thick with the scent of hay, sweat, and the shelter's faint, iron tang. Every muscle in her frame tensed, as if a deep, wild memory was being recalled. Suddenly, the first cub appeared, slick and trembling, sliding from her side with a quiet squelch. A soft tide of relief washed over the humans, yet the lioness remained alert. With careful deliberation, she sniffed at the newborn, her large eyes searching and calculating. Curling instinctively toward her warmth, a second cub followed, still small, still fragile. Then, the vet's hand paused in midair. A sense that something was off gripped him. The shape moving behind the second cub was unlike the delicate frame of a newborn lion. It was too oddly formed, too small, its features twisted in a way that startled even the most seasoned eyes. He swallowed hard, bending in for a closer look. Sensing no immediate threat, the lioness gave the unusual infant a cautious nudge. Her large, golden eyes widened slightly, a look of confusion mingling with recognition. A feeble whimper was the creature's response, its tiny limbs flailing. Nervous glances were exchanged among the staff, uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. Yet, no panic ensued, only a watchful, attentive stillness. Breath held, they observed as the lioness delicately licked the small form, her touch reverent, her tongue surprisingly precise. Stubborn and mysterious, nature had delivered an unexpected gift. Under her vigilant care, the fragile, imperfect little life began to settle. The lioness's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, each movement guided by maternal instinct and the urge for survival. Outside, the sparse trees along the enclosure stirred in the wind, carrying the scent of distant earth and grass. High above, a bird called out, sharp and sudden. In response to the cub's soft whimpers, she answered with a deep, rumbling purr, a sound that wrapped around the humans, offering a quiet assurance. Life endures, even in its most surprising forms. By evening, the light had softened to a honeyed glow, painting the enclosure in muted ambers and golds. Around her three charges, the lioness lay curled, guarding them as if the outside world could wait. The humans slowly stepped back, humbled and with hearts lifted, knowing this unexpected, delicate, miraculous moment would linger forever in memory. She lifted her head once more, cast a brief glance their way, and then returned to her vigil. Beyond the bars, long shadows stretched across the ground. The air was still, disturbed only by the soft breaths of a family slowly learning to begin again. Against the far wall of the enclosure, the lioness rested, her body stretched along the rough concrete floor. Pressed close against her flanks were the three cubs, their tiny forms warm and trembling. Intermittently, she lifted her head, her ears swiveling at the slightest noise, the soft footfall of shelter staff, a crow overhead, the rustle of dried leaves outside. Her eyes were sharp and measured, yet alert. Every movement carried a cautionary weight, a reminder that the world beyond her enclosure had not always been kind. At a careful distance, the vet knelt, his clipboard forgotten, his hands empty but ready. Each morning brought a ritual of quiet observation, with offerings of food placed just far enough away to allow her choice, to give her control. The air was thick with the scent of straw, hay, and the faint, antiseptic tang from the previous day's checks. Through the mesh, sunlight spilled, warming her tawny coat and catching the delicate sheen of sweat on her shoulders. Even in her weariness, a subtle grace was evident in the way she stretched, flexed her limbs, and guided her cubs with gentle nudges. The tiny, abnormal cub stirred, its small limbs struggling for purchase. The lioness's eyes softened, and a low, rumbling purr vibrated in her chest. She nudged him closer, her tongue tracing careful paths along his small, imperfect form. For the watching humans, it was a quiet revelation: trust and maternal instinct could coexist, even with uncertainty. "You're doing just fine, good girl," the vet murmured, his voice soft, barely a whisper. Days passed in a rhythm that was both fragile and deliberate. The cubs grew steadily, wobbling on unsteady legs, chasing stray insects, and tumbling over one another. Each motion was followed by the lioness, correcting with a precise nudge or a gentle growl when boundaries were tested. The unusual cub, so vulnerable and tiny, became the quiet center of attention. Each small triumph, each success, was met with a watchful, measured approval from its mother. Outside, the landscape shifted with the seasons. A breeze would carry the scent of wet earth and distant flowers. Birds chirped and swooped through the treetops, and the shelter echoed with the muted, yet comforting, calls of other animals. In these rhythms, the lioness's body relaxed, a cautious acknowledgement that immediate danger was no longer present. Trust, however, remained a careful negotiation. She would approach only when certain of safety, retreating at the faintest hint of intrusion. The staff learned patience, adapting their movements, their voices, and their presence to her unspoken rules. Each day brought them a step closer. Each day was a lesson in respect, observation, and the subtle language of empathy. By evening, the enclosure glowed with amber light. In a half-circle, the lioness lay, her cubs pressed against her. And for a few moments, time seemed to pause. Feeling the quiet weight of connection, the human stepped back. There were no dramatic gestures, no forced interactions, only the steady, unspoken acknowledgement that trust had begun to take root. Briefly, she lifted her head, her ears flicking at a far-off sound, before returning to her vigil. In the fading light, 3 small shadows were pressed against her flanks, and for a heartbeat, the world outside the enclosure seemed gentle and forgiving. The morning stillness was disturbed by a faint, irregular sound. A soft, wheezing cough came from the smallest cub. The lioness's head snapped up, her eyes scanning her surroundings with heightened awareness. She nudged the tiny form, pressing it close to her chest, her body tense, every muscle coiled with concern. The staff noticed immediately. Already fragile from birth, the unusual cub trembled slightly under the lioness's careful protection. Its tiny chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath shallow and punctuated by quiet, whimpering gasps. The vet approached slowly, crouching low, sensing the lioness's sharp gaze. "She's noticed something," he whispered. "We'll need to be careful." Filtering through the fence, sunlight highlighted the lioness's glistening coat and the delicate sheen of sweat along her shoulders. The enclosure carried a mixed scent of hay, earth, and the faint antiseptic from recent checks. With each movement, dust rose gently, sparkling in the golden light. The cub's fragile struggle drew the mother closer, her massive head curling protectively around it. A low, rumbling purr, filled with urgency and tension, vibrated in her chest. She shifted, nudging the cub with gentle insistence, then stepping back just enough to let the vet observe without alarming her. Time slowed. Taut with worry and watchfulness, each second was drawn out. The lioness's golden eyes followed every movement, her ears flicking at the faintest sound, a crow overhead, leaves rustling against the fence, a distant bark. Her vigilance was relentless, instinct guiding every motion. Kneeling, the vet observed the cub's labored breathing. "We need to check him," he murmured, keeping his voice low and soothing. The lioness's gaze, sharp and assessing, never left them. A subtle nod of understanding passed between human and animal, a quiet acknowledgement that this was necessary, but only with care. With a few gentle movements and soft encouragements, the cub was examined. Its tiny body quivered, but the mother never left her post, pressing her bulk close to the other 2 cubs, her eyes alert. Each lick, every nudge, was a small reassurance, a promise of protection. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying scents of wet soil and distant grass. In the tall trees, birds called, and the sun climbed higher, bathing the enclosure in warm light. The cub's breathing stabilized slightly, a tentative improvement that allowed the lioness a brief, measured relaxation. This time, she lay down fully, her head resting near her tiny charge, her eyes half-closed but watchful. By late afternoon, the tension had eased into cautious relief. The human stepped back, observing from a respectful distance as the lioness resumed her careful grooming of the cubs. The unusual one nestled between her paws. Its tiny breaths evened out, and the mother's tail flicked in quiet contentment. The enclosure fell into a gentle rhythm, punctuated by the soft sounds of the cubs exploring, the low hum of the lioness's purr, and the distant calls of other animals. In the warm air, a fragile trust, tested and affirmed, lingered. Knowing the moment was private, sacred, and fleeting, the humans left slowly. The lioness lifted her head one final time, glancing toward the shelter fence, then returned to her vigilant watch. Huddled against her were three small bodies, their tiny forms a testament to resilience, instinct, and the delicate balance between wild nature and human care. Outside, the sun began its slow descent, casting a soft amber glow over the scene, as if sealing the day with quiet hope. The morning had begun quietly, with sun spilling through the sparse trees and cubs tumbling clumsily after one another, their tails flicking, tiny roars spilling into the still air. Closely watched by the lioness, her ears swiveled and body coiled in readiness. A sudden shift in the wind brought the first scent of rain, sharp and earthy. Quickly, dark and heavy clouds rolled overhead, muting the warm sunlight. The lioness stiffened, her ears pinned back, her tail flicking nervously. Mid-play, the cubs hesitated, their tiny forms huddling close to her legs. The vet noticed the shift instantly. "She senses it," he murmured, moving quietly with empty hands. The lioness's muscles tensed, her eyes sharp and vigilant. The first drops fell, heavy and cold, striking the enclosure in a rhythmic pattern. In the distance, thunder rumbled, low and threatening. Softly, the cubs whimpered, shivering beneath her coat. She nudged them closer, pressing her massive frame against their fragile bodies, each movement deliberate and protective. The wind bent the trees, whipping leaves and dust across the enclosure, but she held her ground, refusing to retreat. The rain intensified, drumming against the metal fencing and pooling in shallow puddles. Staff moved carefully, placing extra hay near the sheltered corners of the enclosure, speaking in low, calm tones. "We're here, it's all right," the vet whispered. The lioness's gaze never wavered, she was assessing, calculating, ensuring her cub's safety. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating her tawny coat and the cub's glistening forms. Her chest rose and fell in deep, controlled breaths, a low growl vibrating in her throat. Even as the storm raged, she remained a pillar of focus, every action precise and protective. In the slick mud, the smallest cub slipped slightly, and she instinctively adjusted, curling around it, shielding it with her bulk. The other two scrambled against her sides, finding warmth and security in the rhythmic press of her body. For a moment, all other concerns vanished. The humans, the storm, the wider world, all were gone, leaving only the immediate bond between mother and young. Quietly, the humans observed, respecting her authority and restraint. There were no sudden movements, no forced actions, only careful support, a shared acknowledgement that nature demanded patience and respect. With a subtle nod of understanding, she accepted their presence, her eyes flicking briefly in recognition before returning to her vigilance. By late afternoon, the storm had eased, leaving the enclosure wet but calm. Puddles reflected the soft light of the sun breaking through the clouds. The lioness stretched, her coat damp but sleek, and nudged her cubs forward to explore again. Their small bodies shivered and stumbled, but she remained close, her tail flicking gently in reassurance. Giving her space, the human stepped back completely. The moment was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of dripping water, distant bird calls, and the low purrs of contentment from a mother and her cubs. In a single, unspoken lesson, survival, trust, and instinct had merged seamlessly. As the last light of the stormy day touched the enclosure, the lioness lay in a half-circle around her cubs, their tiny forms nestled against her. The humans lingered at the fence, silently carrying the memory with them, a day of challenge, of fear, and of unwavering maternal courage, sealed in the soft amber glow of a post-storm sky. Carrying a soft warmth, the morning air was tinged with the scent of dew and distant grass. Across the sunlit patch of the enclosure, the lioness lay stretched. The cubs nestled against her, their tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. Their legs had grown stronger, their roars bolder, their curiosity more insistent. A rustle in the far corner caught the cubs' attention. Hesitant at first, they scrambled forward, their tails twitching. The lioness lifted her head, her muscles coiled, but her eyes softened, a silent permission to explore. Slowly, the cubs moved into the open, sniffing, pawing at the damp earth, testing their balance and boundaries. Quietly, the humans lingered, barely a presence, letting the natural rhythm unfold. "Go on," the vet whispered softly, more to himself than anyone else. The lioness's gaze flicked briefly in acknowledgement but remained fixed on her cubs, attentive yet allowing them space. The smallest cub, still fragile from birth, wobbled forward with unsteady steps. A tiny sneeze echoed in the enclosure, and in response, the mother's head twitched, a low rumble offering a subtle reassurance. With a gentle nudge, she guided, corrected, and encouraged the cub, but never imposed. Each touch, each movement, spoke of patience and trust, honed through weeks of quiet observation. Across the enclosure, sunlight spilled, illuminating the golden fur of the lioness and her cubs, catching on twitching whiskers and slick muzzles. Repeatedly, the cubs tumbled into each other, their claws sliding in the damp soil, their tiny roars mingling with the soft purr of their mother. The air was filled with the scent of wet earth and straw, mingling with the faint, metallic tang of medicine and care from the humans' past interventions. In gentle exploration, hours passed. The lioness followed, a shadow of guidance, occasionally correcting or using a careful nudge to lift a stumbling cub. Yet, her presence felt less like a barrier and more like a safety net, allowing the young lions to discover strength, agility, and independence. Once fragile and uncertain, the unusual cub took its first confident steps, wobbling, but persistent. The lioness's tail flicked once, a subtle gesture of approval. She lay back, her chest rising and falling, her eyes soft and proud, letting her offspring embrace the world in measured increments. A warm breeze stirred the enclosure, carrying the scent of wet soil and distant blooms. Above, birds called, insects buzzed through the sun-dappled grass, and the distant, low hum of other animals framed the quiet scene. The humans stepped back further, giving space, letting the lioness's family claim their moment. As the afternoon light softened into gold, the cubs gathered close to the lioness, their tiny bodies pressed against her as if to store courage for future ventures. She lifted her head briefly, glancing toward the fence, and then returned to her vigilant watch, a silent guardian and teacher. With poetic stillness, the final moments of the day fell. The cubs nestled close, no longer exploring, the wind whispered through the leaves, the sky was a soft canvas of amber and pale blue. Carrying the weight of what they had witnessed, the humans departed quietly. A fragile family, strengthened by instinct, care, and trust, was taking its first steps into a life that was both wild and free. The lioness shifted slightly, her chest rising in deep, contented breaths, her cubs resting around her. Through her, a soft, low purr vibrated, a lullaby of love and survival, sealing the chapter in quiet, enduring grace.